All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Mic'd in New Haven podcast, episode 60. So it's actually a landmark episode. You know, we're 60 episodes into this, and it's crazy. I started this show in 2017 when I was, 17. And here we are 60 episodes later. So this one's going to be a good one. If you haven't checked out the previous one, we dipped away from the emergency service aspect of the podcast and we got back into the news aspect. I talked with Chris Cimino, who was the weatherman on NBC New York for 24 years. He talked about, what it was like working in the newsroom, of course, how he left NBC in 2019 and how he overcame the loss of his wife 5 years ago to cancer. So it was a really good chat with him. He talked about covering Hurricane Sandy as a weatherman, and it was just very, very fun. And if you haven't watched that chat or listened to it, I suggest you do so. And of course, come back March 29th because Tales from the Boom Room, a mini series within the podcast, continues as I continue to chronicle members of the NYPD's Bomb Squad and Arson and Explosion Squad. Don Sadawi will be joining the podcast then. But today, this one's going to be exciting because my next guest is a man who has more than 40 years, I should say, of experience as an investigator, both in the private sector as well as in the police force. A native of Brooklyn, his career began originally as a detective investigator for the New York City Health and Hospitals Corporation's police department. Graduating from the NYPD's Academy in 1981, he'd go on to serve in the Homicide Unit, Dignitary Protection Unit, Intelligence Division, and Hostage Negotiation Unit along the way in a career with the NYPD that would span 20 years before retiring in 2001 with the rank of detective. Since then, working as a media advisor, he's appeared on networks like Fox News and Lifetime, as well as distinguished publications like the Washington Post and the New York Times. Retired NYPD Detective Scott Wagner joins me now on the Mic'd in New Haven podcast. Scott, welcome. How are you?
Hi, Mike. Thanks. It's an honor to be on with you.
Honor to have you.
So wonderful things about you.
All lies. No. But the first question is an easy one. You mentioned growing up in Brooklyn, and your childhood was definitely pretty, like I said, pretty interesting to say the least. So tell me about your upbringing.
Well, again, I grew up in what's called the Crown Heights / Bed-Stuy section of Brooklyn. Mm. I'm a child of the 70s, basically. That's my formative years. Late maybe 69 through 77 is when my parents finally moved out of the neighborhood. But it was rough, but it was good in the sense that I went to local public school, which was 2 blocks down from my house. I attended what was called then an intermediate school. It wasn't a regular junior high. It wasn't like a 3-year junior high. It was 2 years. Because actually combined, I guess I was intelligent back then because I actually combined my last year in junior high with my freshman year in high school. So when I went to high school, I went as what they call a frosh, basically as a sophomore. Mm-hmm. So I only attended high school for 3 years before I graduated. So, but that being said, it was great growing up. The block I lived on, there was 100 kids, all the same age. We were in the streets from 10 in the morning till your parents called you up for dinner. You ran up, you ate as quickly as you could, you ran back down again, and we were out till 10 at night, till long after the lights went on in the street. And then it was come up, take a bath, go to bed, do it all over again. And again, always playing in the street, whether it was the rough touch football, stickball, handball, basketball, whatever it was, football. We were. That's all we did. And we used to play block against block, and every block had their own colored T-shirts or whatever, and we'd make teams and things. And again, but it was rough times, the late 60s, early 70s. You had the proliferation of heroin at the time. There was the proliferation of the BLA coming up and the Black Panthers. Cops were getting killed like crazy. There was a lot of street crime. They used to call them muggings. They were purse snatchers, basically, but they deemed it muggings. The straw that finally broke the camel's back was when my dad, on his way home from work, we lived 3 blocks from the train station, and my dad was walking home from work, and in broad daylight, 5 in the afternoon in the summer, got stuck up at gunpoint, and the only thing he refused to give was his wedding ring, and I'm amazed that they didn't cut his finger off or injured. But that was finally the straw that broke the camel's back. But that being said, it was an interesting time and an interesting place, and I learned a lot from growing up on the street. The other kids, I had an older brother and sister, but they weren't around for me. So my friends' older brothers became my big brother. And also, it was a time when other kids' parents, I was more scared of my best friend's father than I was scared of my own father. Okay? Because he wouldn't hesitate to smack me in the back of the head if I disturbed him.
Yeah.
I mean, and that was good because everyone watched out for everyone.
Right.
Like in the street, you'd have an area, a section where all the young moms would be with the baby carriages. Mm-hmm. Then you'd have another area where the elderly people would be sitting on their beach chairs, because God forbid we were playing ball and the ball rolled over under one of their chairs or something. We used to catch hell and they'd run and tell our parents, and so it was a good thing because everyone looked out for one another.
Right.
It was very good that way. But again, as you're blind to it when you're living in it. When you're living amongst it, you're kind of used to it, and it becomes part of you. But I never realized what a life I led until later on, where, for instance, I never met an Asian person until I was in high school. I never had that encounter. The majority of the neighborhood was Black, and then there was a huge influx of West Indians that came into the area, and there was a lot of infighting between the American Blacks and the West Indians. They did not like one another. And then there was also slowly all the candy stores, the corner candy stores, mm-hmm. became bodegas, became Hispanic grocery stores. Mm-hmm. So the neighborhood changed, as neighborhoods do. Immigrants come and they want to build lives for themselves. And it was a change, but it was such a gradual change. It wasn't overnight. So you just accepted it. But again, now that neighborhood is so sought after. It's gentrified to the max.
Unfortunately.
Well, not unfortunately, but I mean, the neighborhood, the building, just put it this way, the building that I lived in was humongous. It was almost a block long, 6 stories, 1924 construction, 10-foot ceilings, huge rooms, Mm-hmm. I'm sure my apartment was broken up into 2, because my building is now, where I live is now a condo. Okay. So I'm sure, my apartment that we rented for, my whole life, so like I said, from the time I was born till 77, I'm sure is at least $500,000 now, and I lived directly across from what is now Medgar College. It was before that, it was a very prestigious boys Catholic high school called Brooklyn Preparatory High School.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, Joe Paterno went there. Former NFL player Brockington, who's a running back for Green Bay, went there. John Brockington.
Yep.
And it was a very prestigious, boys Catholic prep high school. And again, as the neighborhood changed, they moved out. Medgar College came in and took the property over a couple of years later. And that's when a lot of change, well, that was positive change, but
of course.
Then Medgar started buying property all over Crown Heights. And that's what happened. And we moved to the Sheepshead Bay section of Brooklyn.
That's old school New York right there, as you described it, because I mean, we call New York a cultural melting pot. Because you have your Irish section, your Italian section, your Hispanic section.
Sure.
black, white, Jewish. But it's amazing how even though it blended together, there's still kind of that foreignness, because New York is big and small in that you and I have talked about it off the air. It's small in the sense that you could run into people anywhere that at any given time within the
Most
city.
definitely. Most definitely.
Even in a city of 8 million people, but it's so big in that, there's Chinatown over in one section of the borough or in another borough entirely. And just, it doesn't mean that you're ignorant or don't like them. It's just the way you live your life that you never see it, and you never see it. Like for me, even in New Haven's nowhere near as large as New York City, but we're not a small city either. There are parts of this city living here my entire life that I hadn't been to, till I was like 15, 16, or that I still have never been to, and I'm 21, so it's definitely interesting the way that you describe it.
Well, again, like I said, growing up in that type of neighborhood in those days, you were kind of sheltered because your block was your world.
Right, exactly.
The block you lived on was your world. That was your neighbor, that was your quote unquote neighborhood. Mm-hmm. For instance, another very interesting fact about Crown Heights is Crown Heights also has one of the largest Hasidic Jewish communities in
Yep.
United
They've been in the
States.
news lately.
And there's different sects of the Hasidic community. And their sect, their headquarters was on the corner of Eastern Parkway and Utica Avenue. Mm. And again, that was east of where I lived, a few blocks east. So basically, they grew up side by side, with the black population. Mm. And there was never, it's like everyone respected their own territory, their own turf. That they didn't mingle, they didn't intermingle. They had businesses that neighborhood people would shop at, and they would hire neighborhood people to work for them. But yet, when it came to like playing, school or whatever, no, totally separate. Because all the Hasidic kids, they went to yeshivas, never in any public schools or anything, and that made it a very interesting dynamic in the neighborhood. And of course, it resulted in the early 90s with the Crown Heights riots. And that was because one of the head rabbi's vehicles struck a African-American child on a bike, and he died. And there was rumors that it was done on purpose. And then retaliation started. One Hasidic student got stabbed, and
Yankel Rosenbaum.
Everything else is history. The neighborhood, thank God it survived. It didn't burn. Yeah.
When did you first take an interest in law enforcement?
As a kid, in the streets. I gotta give a shout out and thanks to the great Lieutenant Peter Pranzo, retired NYPD lieutenant, actually the highest decorated supervisor ever in the New York City Police Department. He's a prolific writer. He wrote a book called Harlem Raiders, which will hopefully be a movie soon.
I need to read that book.
He was a young, plainclothes anti-crime cop in the 7-1 precinct, which was the precinct in which I grew up in. And he and his partner would look out for me. And it was not an uncommon thing for them to come rolling through the schoolyard, a couple blocks down from my house, where we'd be playing basketball in the dark, basically. And they'd come rolling through. Back then they used to use cabs or sometimes stolen vehicles that were recovered, they would use plain clothes. They'd come rolling through, literally grab me and throw me in the back of the car, drive me back to my house, and literally put a foot in my butt and said, "Get your butt upstairs where you belong." And and it was, the other thing was, again, the neighborhood I grew up in, it was violent. There was a lot of violence.
Yeah.
A lot of violence. But again, when you're growing up in it, you're not. It's when you leave it that you tend to reflect back and say, "Wow, that was crazy."
Yeah.
That was crazy. But when you're in the mix, when you're in the midst of it, you don't really realize that. So I'm not saying it became acceptable behavior, but it was something that was a normalcy. So when something would occur and the cops would come, and they all seemed to be big in those days. There was no height requirement. So they all seemed to be like, 6 foot and up.
Yeah.
And, the cops would come and I'm a little kid. I'm trying to look through the crowd and see what happened. And, trying to look through some guy's legs or around him. You tug on the cop's, pants leg or whatever and say, "Officer, what happened?" And he'd say, "Don't worry, kid. Just, keep going, keep walking." And it was that inquisitiveness that I loved. I loved that they were there to help. They stuck together. They assisted the community, and they knew what was going on. And I wanted to be part of it. I wanted to know what was going on. I was nosy. I wanted to know too. I wanted to be in on it, right. What they knew. And all of that contributed to my interest in law enforcement. But again, it's so ironic how one of how by accident I could remember his face, till this day, but by accident through another podcast that he was on when he was talking and I was watching, and I realized, oh my God, that's the guy who, because I never got to work with him, unfortunately.
He retired in '89.
I came on in '81, but I never crossed paths with him on the job. And when I saw him on the podcast, even though he had aged, his face didn't change. And then he started talking about where he started his career, and then it clicked, and I was quickly on the computer. I was writing, had it not been for you and your partner, I might not be here now. I could have easily gone the other way.
Right.
It was that type of time and that type of existence. It was easy to have crossed the line. Even though I came from a good upbringing, a good family, it was still easy to cross the line. It was tempting, very tempting. But I'm not saying I was an angel.
Right.
But again, they would drag me home and look out for me and always tell me. They would drive by slow, or even if we were playing football on the street or stickball, they would drive by slow and give me that look, and say like this, like, we're watching you. And I appreciated it. I'd always give them a smile because it made me feel good inside, made me feel safe, that I knew they were out there looking out for me and protecting me.
Because it creates respect, and then
without a doubt.
The other podcast that Scott was referring to is our friends over at Police Off the Cuff, which is a great podcast that has been a great help to me, and it's been two great guys in Bill and Mark. But that, because it's the same thing with me growing up down here. I mentioned this before. My mom to this day is really good friends with a lot of the guys that worked in the New Haven Fire Department, the police department. And, there was just one joke with one particular friend of the family. He just retired from the New Haven PD recently. He would say, "Oh, if I ever saw Michael in the street, goofing off, not that I was ever that type of kid, and doing something he was not supposed to, I hit him with the nightstick and get him in the car so quick, and I drive him right back to your house. Don't worry about it." You're saying this to my mother.
Well, to be honest with you, that carried over into my way of policing. When it was my turn.
Yeah.
That theme of, bringing a kid, if you got a kid in a compromising position and you knew in your heart he wasn't really a bad kid, he just
made a bad choice. Yeah.
Yeah, or he was the wrong place at the wrong time, and it's not like he shot someone or stabbed someone. Maybe it was just a fight in the street or something, something minor. I would much rather give him the option, dragging him back, by the scruff of the neck to his parents' house, because he's more scared of his mother and father than he is of me. and the whole thing was, you bring him back to the parents, and if the parents do the right thing with him, now you didn't give a kid a record who really didn't deserve it,
right?
For doing something stupid or idiotic or foolish that young people just do,
Yeah,
you
of
know,
course.
today. And also you gained a friend in the parent. And that's what law enforcement's all about,
Yeah, that's what it
is
should be.
gaining trust of the community and, working hand in hand with the community. And one hand washes the other.
Right.
And who knows if I might have to call upon that person for a favor one day, if a crime went down in that building. I say, wait a minute, I know I can go to apartment whatever, and
They'll
I
tell
know
you.
Mrs. Jones lives there, and I brought her son home one day, so let me go talk to her, because people tend to know what goes on around them.
Right.
They might be hesitant to speak, but if they trust you, they'll talk to you, and that's what it's all about.
Irma Rivera, sorry to cut you off. What was that?
No, you said Irma? You
Yeah,
were
Irma Rivera told the story when she was on this podcast. And Irma, I hope you were watching. She
So am I. Hi, Irma.
she mentioned that, she, to this day, she does this to certain kids that she doesn't know, but she'll see them doing, as you said, kids that, they're not really bad kids, but they're doing something that they shouldn't be doing. And she's like, oh my God, I know your mother. I'm going to tell your mother. And then she
Irma's old school. Irma's old school. And it's funny because Irma, I think she came on maybe 6 months after me.
Yeah.
And we were on patrol in the same neighborhood. We knew one another. We were both in plain clothes at the same time, even though I was in housing and she was in NYPD, but the area in which I covered was primarily her precinct. So we would do joint operations together, Then later on, as a detective, I came in contact with her a lot. We worked cases together, not one-on-one as partners. I was never fortunate enough to be partners with her.
Yeah.
But I respect Irma to the max. She was always the greatest attitude, a go-getter, never said, she never backed down, a lot of heart, and very knowledgeable. A great
lady. Yeah,
and
great.
A good person at heart. A good person at heart. She's a sweet.
Oh, she was the best. Yeah, I have to have her on again someday. She was a lot of fun to talk to. I could listen to her all day, And she told me this, and to her point, yes, I'm down for it. She said when this pandemic's over, she wants to meet up for lunch. I'm in. So yeah, well, hopefully we can do that. Hopefully you can be there too. So
she's good people, really is.
Oh, definitely, for sure. So you when you took you mentioned this off the air before we began. You took the NYPD test in 79. Now, this was during the fiscal crisis, if I'm not mistaken, that the city was undergoing. So there were
the fiscal crisis actually ended at that time.
Okay. All right.
It really hit its peak in 75. That's when Gerald Ford, there was a famous headline in the paper. Basically, he told New York City to go screw itself.
Yeah.
I don't remember the exact headline, but it was
something. I think it was drop dead.
Yeah, something to that effect. They wouldn't give federal money to bail out New York.
Right.
A. Beam was the mayor. He wasn't the best mayor, that there was, and he lost control of the budget. And that being said, a lot of cops, firefighters, they were closing firehouses. They were laying off police, and it was the first time it had ever occurred. And at the time, a lot of civil service workers were Vietnam vets.
Right.
And here they come back from the war, they take a civil service test. Now they got stability, they've got benefits, they're happy, they're doing something worthwhile. They start getting married, starting families, buying homes, and now bang, out of nowhere, they get pink slips. And thank God, some guys were picked up by corrections. Some guys went to various smaller police departments. A very good friend of mine, he ended up, a lot of them drove buses. They became bus drivers. And that was one of the most frustrating aspects. I had a couple of partners in plain clothes that became bus drivers. And I know one of them, he he had a school run, basically, that on the bus line he went, where he went between two high schools. So you can imagine what went on in his bus,
Yeah. Fights,
And
all
here
that different stuff.
you come from a position of authority, and now it's total chaos going on around you. People are refusing to pay. People, are just getting on, they're jumping off, they're hanging on the back. So he got to the point that he pulled the bus over, got out, went to a payphone, and said, "Listen, if you want your bus, it's on the corner of such and such. I'm out of here." And I tell you, that was I'm telling you, I so much respect for him. And then he landed on his feet. He got into the Brooklyn DA's office, where he became an investigator. And then once again, they started slowly rehiring all those guys. My group was actually the first era of new blood coming into the police department after they rehired. They rehired about, I would say, close to 90% of the guys that were laid off. Because some, like a good friend of mine, he had like 6 years on at the time, and when he got laid off, and he got a position in correction, and he liked it, and he ended up doing 20 more years in corrections. He stayed there, so he found a home. God bless him. So again, but we were the first new blood to come in, which was an interesting concept, because you had guys that were pretty disgruntled because they were angry at the city for what the city did to them and put them through and their families through. So they were doing the job, but they were kind of going through the motions. And when we came in and we're all eager, to hit the street running, and we're all full of piss and vinegar, and we want to get out there and fight crime and do good.
Yeah.
Kind of ignited a light in these guys, because they saw themselves in us when they started, and it rejuvenated a lot of guys' careers. It made them feel like cops again, and that's when things started to change in the city, because the guys were into it again. They were back doing what they wanted to do, and they were proud of it, and they had the backing of the city then. Unlike now, unfortunately, where they're not back.
We're talking with retired NYPD Detective Scott Wagner here in the Mike in New Haven podcast. More with Scott with just a second, but first, a word, as always, from our unofficial sponsors over at the Cozy Babe, which is my sister's fashion blog. So for those of you that have ladies in your life, whatever the relationship, mom, sister, girlfriend, wife, whatever, or just simply friends that are female, if you're interested in fashion, or if you're a lady listening to this podcast, head on over to the Cozy Babe, TheKozie BABE on Instagram. She is not paying me for this ad, but as I said before, she's going to.
She's your sister. She's your sister.
She
Sisters
is.
Don't pay.
Well, a little $5 on the side won't hurt anybody, But anyway, we'll see what happens there. I love you to my older sister who will watch this later. So you're the first cop that I've had on, or retired cop that I've had on the show that didn't start with the NYPD. You started, as you were just talking about, with the housing police, because obviously it's 1981 when you came on. Back then, there's 3 different police departments, in the city. There's NYPD, there's the transit police, which handles obviously the subways and things like that. And there's the housing police, or NYPD police, as they were also referred to, which handled all the housing projects or developments throughout New York City. So joining at that time, in 1981, Mark kind of explained this process to me when he came on, that, you would take a test, I think, and they would tell you, okay, city, housing, transit. When you got to that point, it was a housing class. It was actually a housing academy. It was exclusively housing. Talking with you, you sounded like you loved it. It wasn't like, oh, you were aiming for the city. You didn't get to be in the NYPD, so they sent you to housing. You learned to love it. Let me explain
to you what went on. There was one test at that time.
Yeah.
Now, prior to that time, there were separate tests for the transit police and separate tests for the housing police. The housing police started in 1952. I believe the transit police a couple of years earlier, okay, as an actual police force. At the time of the merge in 95, all 3 departments were at their highest levels. The transit police had approximately 7,000 uniformed members, and the housing police had almost 3,000. We were actually the 24th largest police department in the country, when you think about it, and with only 3,000 cops. You know, and again, you had 35,000 cops in the NYPD.
Right.
So, you're taking on another 10,000 cops. Now, with that being said, there was one test given for all three jobs back in '79 when I took the test. And at the time, again, it boggles my mind how the city was able to get away with what they did, but it was very prejudicial in my view, is that they would they had minority quotas. They had broken the list down into three groups: the white group, a Hispanic group, and a black group. And if you scored, let's say you were Hispanic and you scored a 99.9, you should go in the first round. Come on, that's almost a perfect score.
Yeah.
But then they wouldn't go to the next Hispanic guy under you or the next person under you because he might be white. So they would go to the next list and get the highest guy on the black list, who might have scored maybe a full point less, because there's thousands of guys on this list.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So those little 0.9, 0.999s or whatever that you score give you the difference between getting hired or not. So they were doing one white, one black, one Hispanic, one white, one black, one Hispanic.
Never fly today. Never.
Well, again, I don't know how it flew then, but that's what they did. They wanted diversity, but they went about it the wrong way.
Yeah.
Instead of going into the communities and just recruiting, they actually made three separate lists. Now, again, I don't fault any of the guys that were on those lists. It wasn't their fault. Everyone did their best to pass the test. Obviously, why would you take a test and not try to do your best to pass it?
You don't do it half-heartedly.
Yeah. I mean, I remember I attended classes, and even though looking in hindsight, the less you know about police work, the better off you are taking an exam to become a cop, because it has nothing to do with police work. It's reading comprehension, math, and reasoning. That's what the questions are. So the more you know, the more you'll read into the question, and you might screw it up because you're thinking from a cop's point of view instead of a civilian, which you are. Yeah. Just like I took the fire department test. I got called immediately, within weeks. Again in '79, to the fire department. And the day I went for my, the physical test, I was in an armory in the summer in Sumner Avenue, all the way up in Bed-Stuy. It's a huge National Guard armory. They had tanks and jeeps. It was a huge building. It was like a whole square block and maybe 6 stories tall. And they had a track around it. And after I even went to classes for it, because the fire department was their physical was very hard, very difficult, because at the time there were no females on the fire department. And I attended classes, and at the last event you had to do after maybe 7 different events was a mile run. And again, it had to be over 100 degrees in there, and we're in groups of 7. And you start bonding with the guys that are with you, because let's face it, you're on the same boat, and so you pull for one another.
Right, of course.
And the group ahead of us, we were group 7. The group ahead of us, group 6, they're running around doing their mile run, and you had to do it in a certain amount of time. It wasn't an 8-minute mile. It was a reasonable time, and they gave you time to rest in between events. Suddenly I hear whistles going off, people are running, all kind of craziness is going on. And we look over from where we're, seated on the floor waiting. and there's a guy laying down. He dropped dead. And I come to find out that this guy is a Green Beret. And I'm saying to myself, if he's a Green Beret, and those guys they're in shape.
Yeah, tip-top shape.
I mean, I'm saying if he died, I'm out of here. It's not meant for me. And I said, where do I sign? I don't want to do this. And they were begging and pleading with me. I said, no, it's not meant to be. And I signed out, and I waited for the police department. And again, it's not a quick process to get on the police department. First of all, they have to exhaust the prior list, and then get to the new list, establish the list, and like I said at that time, break it down into 3 bands, and then once you're picked, or they let you know that you're a candidate, now you have to start your background investigation. You fill out a ton of forms. You have to go through your physical, your medical, all these various things before you're actually sworn in. And for instance, I remember when we came on, our investigation even continued while we were still in the academy, because they were trying to push us through so fast. Now, again, to digress, the reason I chose housing was because there was a small blurb in a civil service newspaper called The Chief, which talked all about all civil service, everything civil service. And again, I was taking all the tests, and as were my friends at the time. And there was a small blurb that the only department that had their minority quota filled was the Housing Authority Police Department. They were actually looking to fill a non-minority class. And a good friend of mine who I grew up with, his older brother, was a housing cop. And unless you grew up in the projects, or you lived near the projects, or had relatives that lived in the projects, no one really knew about the housing police in general. More people were well aware of the transit police because
they were the subways
of the city of New York rides, the transit system. So right. They came in contact with the transit police. So they were, much more known than the housing police. So, we would visit him when he was working at times and bring him lunch or whatever. And he told us, he said, it's a smaller department, it's closer knit, and you might have better room for advancement quicker. And so I was so anxious to become a cop, I joined up for it. And my class ended up being the last housing academy class of its own. Each department had their own academy at one time: transit, housing, NYPD. By 79, everyone went through the NYPD Academy, and they were designated. Maybe, I don't know how they did it, every 5th guy, 6th guy. Okay, you're going to transit. You're going to housing. Next, you had no choice. But with me, I had a choice, and I opted to take the housing department. And again, I was scheduled to go into the NYPD July 81 class, but instead we went in April of 81, and we ran concurrent with we graduated in September, where they graduated, in December. So, and we didn't have to be re-indoctrinated into the housing way of doing things, because our academy was all housing instructors. Now, of course, we used the NYPD range, both indoor and outdoor, for our training. Our uniforms came from, the NYPD equipment section, all our leather goods, all our, like that. But again, every department had their own certain way of doing things, but there was parity across the board in pay, benefits, was complete parity, and police powers, complete parity with all three departments. And with that being said,
the bat phone's ringing, Scott. You got to answer that call, man.
No,
people need you.
My bell. If you want to.
All right, we'll take a break here in the Mike in New Haven podcast, and we'll continue with Scott Wagner in just a second. All right, we took a quick break there while Scott tended to something, so we're back. Where did we leave off? We were talking about.
Okay, we were talking about the academy, the housing academy that I was in. Again, we were the last solely trained by housing instructors. Mm-hmm. Okay, after that, everyone went through the NYPD Academy. Mm-hmm. My class consisted of 55 individuals, all white, majority, 2 African American, 5 women, no Hispanics. That was my class. And again, it was a weird concept that, like I told you about the minority quotas that the city placed on the various departments, and it does boggle my mind that happened, and they were able to get away with it, but they did, and it was for the best. Housing, again, a small job, very tightly knit, family oriented. Everyone knew everybody, and we basically wrote the book on community policing before anyone ever said community policing.
A young Scott Wagner.
That's my first encounter with the press from an arrest I made early on in my career.
For those of you watching who will watch the YouTube version of the show, you will see this. But for those of you that are listening on the audio version, what I'm showing right now is a picture of a young Scott Wagner as a housing police officer for an arrest that he made there.
Yeah, all patches were on the left arm. Housing and transit, all patches were on the left. NYPD there were on the right.
Okay. So that is a picture there.
That was basically the only difference that you could tell in the street, the difference between the departments.
Yeah, if you didn't look directly at the patch. So, when you get on the job,
right.
You talked about wanting to hit the ground running, and obviously you guys did.
We were all very eager.
So tell me about those early years. I mean, tell me about the wilder encounters that you had, some of the funniest things that you did, and some of obviously the more rewarding work that you did from those early years.
Upon graduation of the academy, you graduated on a Friday, and Monday you reported to your command. Mm-hmm. And again, in that it was a smaller department, and I told you that my friend's brother had been on that job for a while.
Right.
It was already predetermined who our various training officers would be. And the beauty of housing at the time was it was one-on-one training with what was known as your FTO, or your field training officer. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a group of 5 probationary cops with one guy, one senior cop, and they were all following him around trying to learn. He was your partner for 3 months. For 90 days, he was your partner. Every shift you worked, everything you did, whatever. At the time, we worked around the clock. We did set of days, set of midnight, set of 4 to 12s, and it repeated and repeated and repeated. It's a brutal chart to work. Because
imagine
at times you didn't know if you were coming or going. But that being said, and then if you made an arrest in between and had to go to court, that threw a wrench in the whole thing. Because now, one day you're eating dinner at 6 a.m, and the next day, you're eating breakfast at 10 at night. You don't know if you're coming or going. It was a very hard chart to work, a hard life in those days. But that one-on-one with your field training officer, he was your guide, your mentor, your big brother, and ironically enough, he was only a couple of years, 2 years older than me, and he only had 8 months experience over me.
Wow.
I mean, that's because I told you, we were the first groups to come back after the layoffs. So, the department was young. And all these young guys coming on, they had to be trained properly in the street, in tactics. And he would teach us everything from, how to answer the radio calls, how to listen to that radio, how to be attentive, to know where you were at all times, to glance if you're walking a footpost, always glance over, see the address that you're at. God forbid something should jump off, you could put that over the radio, you know where you are. That's the worst thing when you chase someone into a building, or God forbid, and you get into a situation and you call for help and you don't know where you are. And it happens. It happens in the height of the battle. It happens. Taught everything: how to write a summons properly, how to deal with the public, how to use your best weapon, which is not your firearm, which is not your mace, which is not your taser or your baton. It's your mouth. That is your best weapon that you have in your toolbox. Okay? And the most important thing was learn how to talk to people and learn how to listen to people. Listen to what they have to say. Learn how to keep an even keel. Learn how not to take things personal. That was one of the greatest things that my FTO taught me. And I gotta say his name. He's gone. His name is Robert Kelly. He was a mentor of mine all through my career. As a matter of fact, when I got promoted to detective, it was his shield that I was given. He reserved it for me. But that's another story. But again, we lost him a few years ago. But
sorry,
well, it happens. But he would stress that don't take anything personal. It's business. It's, for instance, when it comes to the criminals, it's their job to be criminals. It's our job to catch them. Okay, some days they win, some days you win. But tomorrow's another day.
Right.
And the basic thing is you want to go home at night, or home to your family, in the same condition you left. That's the idea. Okay? You don't want to get hurt. You don't want to get involved in a situation that you can't handle. So awareness had a lot to do with it. We would be, for instance, riding in the car, and suddenly he'd say, "Stop," and I stop the car. He'd say, "Where are we? Don't turn your head." And I'd have to, know where I was positioned, because, and again, that taught me almost subliminally, keep your head on a swivel. Always, when you're in the car, I don't care how cold it is outside, you got to have that window open a little bit. You got to be able to hear a gunshot or a woman screaming, for help,
right.
and you have to be able to develop what they term as cop's eyes. You have to be able to, it's people watching skills. You have to be able to develop ways of looking at people and observing them and seeing the things that they do and what they don't do and how they react in situations. And all of this knowledge was drilled into us day after day. Again, in housing, one of the big things that we had to do was vertical patrols of the building, where we would basically walk in the building, look around the lobby, take the elevator, if it was working, all the way up to the top floor. We would then proceed up to the roof landings, out onto the roof, and then walk the buildings down. Because a lot of crime took place within the stairwells, and in those days, there was a proliferation of drugs, of course. So a lot of junkies and crackheads.
It's the 80s. 80s was a wild time.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It was, and again, I had the great fortune of working in what was PSA 5, which stands for Police Service Area in housing. It's the equivalent to a precinct. Housing had 9 precincts citywide. And PSA 5 was Manhattan, But you had PSA 4, which covered Lower Manhattan, Lower East Side, basically, and PSA 5 covered everything from the boundaries were the 2-0, 2-4, the 2-8, 2-3, the 2-5 precincts. And that's mostly Spanish Harlem and part of Central Harlem. The lower
Barrio.
Barrio, exactly. And as a young cop, that's where I felt I grew up. The streets of Spanish Harlem are so important to me because the culture, the sounds, there was always music playing 24/7. It seemed almost as if sometimes you'd be riding in a radio car on patrol, and it was almost as if you were in a movie with background music. There was always some beat going on. There was, in the summertime, the smells of the cooking, some of the most beautiful women in the world, exotic women that I've ever encountered, as a matter of fact, that's where I met my wife. Again, it was an exotic place. What made it also a great place to work was it's the 23rd precinct has the largest contingency of housing authority developments in it than any other precinct. I think with maybe the exception of the 7-5 precinct in Brooklyn and East New York and Brownsville. And so basically the majority of the precinct was housed in New York City housing developments, projects. So our precinct alone would turn out on every shift a minimum of 4 cars, plus a sergeant and his driver, and possibly a conditions car, which would back up the other cars and cover us if you were on your meal period or whatever. And that didn't include all the foot cops that were assigned to various projects on foot. So we turned out a lot of manpower. But again, it was so overwhelming that a lot of times, and again, when I first came on, housing was on their own radio frequencies. So, we would there was a centralized phone number. We weren't part of the 911 system. There was a centralized phone number. And if memory serves, I think it was 876-5000, if memory serves. I hope someone doesn't have that number now. But
wouldn't help you.
That led you directly to the housing police. And almost every apartment that you went into had that sticker over the telephone, to call the housing police, dial this number. And then you'd be dispatched. We had our own dispatchers. But again, there was a 911 system. So there was a lot of duplication of work because someone would call 911. Technically, if the 911 operator knew it was a housing location, they were supposed to hand it off to housing dispatchers. But again, there's always confusion and again, the jobs would keep coming and coming and coming. So oftentimes, jobs would come over in the projects, and you'd get there and there'd already be, let's say, 2 cars and a 2-3 there, or vice versa, or you'd get there and you'd get no backup because they didn't even know what was happening because it went straight to you. So what my partner and I used to do was we used to have to go as soon as we, let's say we were working a 4 to 12. As soon as we got out in the car, checked it out, made sure it had gas, we'd zoom over to the 23rd precinct and sign out one of their radios. Then we'd head over to either the 2-5 or the 2-8 precinct and sign out one of their radios because they were on 2 different divisions. 4th division was the 2-3 and the 19th, and the 6th division had the 2-5 and the 2-8. So this way, basically, so we're carrying 3 radios. We're carrying the house. Each of us have a housing radio.
This is MacGyver type police work.
An NYPD radio, because you could literally be driving down the street and you could drive into a gun battle or a bank robbery or something, and you're totally unaware of it because you're on a frequency that the NYPD is not on. You know, so it was such, and we would, and if we, we're cops, we have the same what's called geographical area of employment. We're police throughout the state of New York. So driving, let's say, from project to project, you're in city streets, or you're walking across the street. Let's say you're walking across from the project to a grocery store to get a water or something, or a pack of cigarettes or whatever it was. Now you're not any longer on housing property. You know what I'm saying? So you could be walking into a robbery and not know it. But meanwhile, cops are responding because they know what's happening.
Yeah.
That posed a big, big problem. And again, this goes back to your FTO. You were trained to have that radio in the background. It's constant chatter. And you had to learn to listen for your call sign, whatever your call sign was. Like, for instance, I worked in PSA 5. The sector in which my partner and I covered was the EF, Eddie Frank sector. Okay. And our sector actually ran through 3 precincts. It went from the 19th precinct into the 2-3 precinct into the 2-5 precinct. That's how big a sector we covered alone. Okay. We were the most eastern sector of the area, and which encompassed First Avenue, or basically from 70th and First to 124th and First, back over to Second and down again. That was our sector. That's huge.
Wow. Yeah, it's a lot of territory.
And it was not uncommon on a Friday night in the summer to handle 25 to 30 jobs. You were
in one shift,
constantly running. I mean, it was great as a young cop, because everything's a learning experience. So, but the greatest thing was when we all, soon after that, when I was only in uniform for a year in total, my 3 months in field training, and then for about 10 months after, I was uniform, and then I was my partner and I, my radio car partner and I, were requested to become plainclothes, go into the anti-crime unit, and that's when we went on the NYPD frequency, and oh my God, then it changed. That's when things started to change for the better, because now, we're hearing everything that's going on. They're hearing us, we're hearing them. There's a better understanding. There's less of a divide between the departments. There's more of a brotherhood forming. And again, I'm very fortunate in the areas in which I worked that we had such a great rapport with the NYPD cops that we worked with, and they us, because they knew we were there to back them. Irregardless, I responded to many, many jobs that had nothing to do with the project, because I was a block away and there was a guy calling for help, and I don't care, he's wearing a blue uniform. Irregardless if he's transit, he's housing, whatever. There were plenty of times we'd run what they call down into the hole, which is the subway, because there was a robbery, and the perpetrator fled down into the subway on Lexington Avenue. So you have one car would shoot to 116th and Lex, one car would shoot to 110th and Lex, one car would shoot to 103rd and Lex, the train stations, and they'd run down. And of course, no radios work down there. Even transit radios didn't work.
Yeah.
So, but it was the whole idea of we were there for each other. Like I said, working with Irma, many times we responded to the same job, and we would sometimes laugh it off. There was always complaints, no housing available. Of course, there's no housing available because we were overwhelmed with work, And now, again, the what was the housing police is now a bureau within the NYPD. The housing bureau is a transit bureau in the NYPD. And to tell you the truth, I don't like it. I don't think they get the resources they need, those two bureaus, to do the job that's needed from them. When they had the separate departments, again, I can't speak really for transit, but in housing, we were the ones who took care of our community, and our community was the residents of public housing. That's who we took care of. You know, we walked through those projects. We were known. They knew our names. We would. It was very commonplace. It's just as simple. You walk past someone, give them a nod and a smile. It's not going to kill you. And that alone lets people know you're human. You know, you see now a lot of things online with cops playing basketball with kids or whatever, and it's such a big deal, and it goes viral. We were doing that, you know, just on our own. You know, I can't tell you how many times, you know, my partner and I would be walking a foot post together in a particular project, and there'd be a basketball game going on, and one of us would take our gun belts off and give it to the other guy and say, "All right, come on, you know, give me the ball." And you would just go work. Just to do it. We were young, and we were having fun, and it was a bonding thing with the kids, and the kids saw you were a regular guy. Yeah. Or if you saw kids throwing around a football, you say, "Come on, throw it over here. Go long, go deep," and you throw them a pass or whatever. Little things like that, and you'd be surprised how much respect you get behind that.
Yeah, it goes a long way. It goes a long way because of that. You know, you're able to see them as you said, as human beings, and not because people see the uniform first. You know, They don't know the person behind the uniform, and so it's important that they get to know the person behind the uniform. And I do want to dive more into the merger later. So it's interesting that you brought that up. But before we get to that, you know, Housing Police was around for 43 years. They lost some guys, some good men along the way. And in the 14 years you were with Housing before they merged, some men were lost. I'll share the screen now for those of you watching the YouTube version. From 81 to 95, these were some of the guys that got killed in the line of duty, unfortunately. You know, you mentioned earlier Housing being a tight-knit department.
Right.
Those guys
are just. I'd like to interject.
Please do.
When I was in the academy, I think again we started April of '81, April 13th of '81, and I believe in May of '81, a housing cop got killed off duty, and our instructors we were the first academy class to attend what's known as an inspector's funeral. Okay, which they give to a police officer killed in the line of duty, and they made sure we stood.
Was it him? Before you continue, was this was Lieutenant Chan Brinkers?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
May of '81. Yes.
All right.
He was killed off duty in a robbery attempt.
Yes, in the Bronx. It says here.
And they made sure we went to his funeral, and that we experienced it and saw that line of blue that seemed to extend for forever. And we were part of that line. And that bonded us so quickly. Because remember, you're 55 people. I happen to know, again, my friend was in the class with me. So that's one person I knew. But suddenly, after that day, and we're there for less than a month, we are now cemented together. All of us, all 55 of us are as one, just from that funeral. Because it showed us, wow, we're part of a much bigger family than we realize. We're part of a brotherhood, sisterhood, and a family. And when you saw, again, it was first for me ever. And, you know, you saw it on TV because, again, in the 70s, there was such a proliferation of cops getting killed that you saw it on TV every night. But it's not to be there and hear the bagpipes and hear everyone snap to attention as far as the eye can see. And you see the, you know, hundreds of motorcycles from departments coming from all over the country, you know, on a moment's notice, you know, showing respect and paying their respects to a fallen brother. And that bonded us. It was one of the smartest things that our instructors did was making us attend. And it was done on the fly. It was done like that morning. It was decided that our captain in the academy decided, I want these kids, and we were kids basically. I want these kids to see what they're looking at. I want them to know the reality of the job, that you might not come home. It's not, it's not a movie. It's not a TV show. It's reality. And believe me, it was a good reality check, but it also bonded us. We became so tight that, it's one thing. You might not ever work in your whole career with someone from your academy class. You could do 20, 30 years and never even cross paths with someone. But you'll come to a reunion or a retirement party or a holiday party, and you'll see them. You'll never forget your classmates. And there's always that bond, that hug, because you went through that 5.5 months together. You pushed each other physically when it came to the physical part of it. Guys pushed each other. Guys, there were some guys that weren't as good academically as others, so they held their own little study groups. We got real tight, real close. And ironically, my last partner, who we were in the we met in the academy. He was from the Bronx, the North Bronx. I'm from the southern end of Brooklyn. We just, he's Italian, I'm Jewish. It was just one of those things that we just became instantaneous friends. And he and I ended up being partners on and off for 18 years.
Wow.
And he was my last steady partner in the detective bureau. Tom Lombardo. He's a fantastic detective, and he's a supervisor in Manhattan DA's office now.
Shout out to Tom. I hope he watches. And for those of you that are not watching the video version, I just showed a picture of the officer I showed a picture of was Lieutenant Jan Brinkers, who was killed off duty during a robbery attempt gone wrong in May of 1981 out in the Bronx. So, as I said, I showed those other faces too from 81 through 95. Before I get to that, I do to your last point, I do just want to add, somebody brought this up, the fire department and the police department are really the only two professions where you can not see somebody for 25 years. You see that person again, and it's not awkward. It's like no time ever went by.
It's like
you just pick up where you left off. Absolutely.
It's like, even to today, I'm out over 19 years. There's people that don't understand sometimes about the camaraderie part of police work and the fire department more so, because you are really living together.
Yeah, of course.
So you're sleeping in the same place, you're eating together, you're actually living together.
That's why they call each other brothers,
Exactly. They call themselves a brotherhood, right? They're much tighter than cops, because again, our lives depend on one another. But at the end of the tour, the end of the shift, you go your separate ways. I mean, you might go out for a drink or dinner or whatever, but most times you go your separate ways. Then tomorrow's another day, you come back together again. But at the fire department, they live together. And there's also the division in the fire department that's different than the police department is the separation between management and when I say management, supervisors and the line officers. In the fire department, you might be on that nozzle of a hose, and there might be a battalion chief right behind you who's just as anxious to get into that fire as you are. Yeah. Because, and yet in the police department, they tried like an experiment to really separate the sergeants from the cops. They made them wear white shirts for a while, to show, quick designation that they were superior officers. But it didn't seem to work well, because even though you're a sergeant and now you're running a platoon of men, you're still, yes, you're their boss, but you're still on the street with them.
Right.
You're responding to calls. You're backing up your own cops. You're not just ordering them around. You're not just saying, Wagner, do this. Cologne, do this. Okay? They're out there with you on the street. So that's where you see sergeants wearing the same uniforms as cops. Of course, they have the 3 chevrons to designate their rank, and they wear a yellow, a gold band on their hat to designate their supervisory status. Yes, but uniform-wise, they're wearing the same blues. Lieutenants and above wear white shirts.
White shirts.
And that designates management. Once you're a lieutenant, you're really management. Okay? And you don't have that in the fire department. You don't have that division in the fire department. See, the police department, certain units, I've had the pleasure of working in housing and in NYPD with lieutenants and captains and above that were literally on the street with me doing stuff because they wanted to. They were cops at heart, even though they had rank.
Louis Anamone was the chief of department. You were telling me Louis Anamone was still grabbing guys.
Chief Anamone is a rare man.
I gotta get him on.
My first encounter with Chief Anamone was he was the CEO of the 20th precinct and 20 precinct in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, the Lincoln Center area of Manhattan, and there's a huge housing complex there called Amsterdam Housing. There was a big uptick in drugs for a period of time in the 80s. I was in plain clothes, and there was a shooting. And what Chief Anamone said, I want to do a warrant sweep through the projects. I don't care if it's for disorderly conduct, trespass. We're going in and we're taking everybody we can because we need intel. Everyone needs to be debriefed. And again, he was very ahead of his time. And I remember we were broken up into teams that had assignments. Each team was like 7 of us, and there was a supervisor and 6 cops, and you had packages of these are the warrants you're going after. Maybe in one building, that's your building, or whatever, however it would work. Or you have 3 floors in that building, because it's a large complex. Anamone was my team leader, and he's the CEO of the precinct. And usually, because I was a big guy, I was 6'2" and solid 240, I was usually the first guy through the door. And, on many occasions. And, oh no, he pushed me right out of the way. He's half my size. He went right through that door. I mean, that's the man he is. And he, when you're doing an operation like that, you're in plain clothes. So you might have raid jackets on, or that certain things to designate that you're police, but you're not. You have uniforms backing you up. They have the perimeter, in case this is what they call runners. People going out of windows, whatever. They control the perimeter, and they come in and they'll take the prisoners from us, so we can move on to the next thing. But it's usually the plainclothes guys that are hitting the doors, and I remember him saying to me, don't call me captain. Our group, don't say captain, don't say boss, call me Louis, because we're all in this together. And I have to, and then again, as later on after the merge as chief of department, my partner and I had a couple of encounters where, we had to leave the state in a moment's notice because the guys that we were looking for turned up out of state, and you had to get permission to jump on a plane, and you had to run to get all kinds of papers signed and airline tickets and pocket money,
all that jazz,
all that stuff. And he had to sign off on it as chief of department. He basically was the guy to sign off on it, and he loved it. He loved it. You could see the gleam in his eye. He said, "Oh, go get him, go get him." He's such a great guy, and again, saved this city on 2 occasions from burning. Again, the Crown Heights riots that I mentioned earlier. He was the one who took control and developed the basic disorder control. He said, we're taking the streets back 1 block at a time. It's over. We're taking them back. Same thing, Washington Heights riots that occurred after a police involved shooting that the community deemed was wrong, but
was this the one? Because you and I, I know him through LinkedIn. I don't know if you know him personally. Was this the one where O'Keefe killed Kiko Garcia?
Yeah, Michael Keefe. Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, I know.
92.
Yeah, I know Mike. Mike's a great cop, great detective.
Yeah, he did the right thing. Kiko,
yeah,
he did what
Kiko
he had to do.
Garcia. He got into a gunfight. Again, it's going back to not knowing where you were. He wasn't cognizant of the address, and they couldn't get to him quick enough.
Yeah, who would be in a moment like that, you know?
He saw. He went after a guy with a gun. He saw it. He just ran, and he thought he got the address, but he didn't. He got the wrong building. So he was in a do-or-die battle for his life, and of course, right away, they hung him in effigy. They said he assassinated the guy. It was so wrong, but it went through the neighborhood like wildfire. Next thing you know, everybody's mobilized because, and again, Louis Animone, we're taking it. They vented for a night or two. No more. It's over. That's it. We're going in.